Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our podcast. First of all, it's amazing to be back in the podcast. And last week we had a very interesting talk, kind of like talking a little bit about like what's happening in the Easter side and just having some fun, a little bit different kind of viewpoint, and of course sharing an interesting story from the beach soccer world. And today we're here with Kenneth Cortsen. Welcome to our podcast. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ole. I appreciate it.
So, Kenneth, today we're going to have a very interesting topic. We're going to talk something that sits the both close to us, to our heart, in terms of how the coronavirus is impacting the Nordic sports landscape. And it's pretty rough being a Nordic sport business at the moment, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yeah.
And I think, like, before we dive into that, why don't you just give like a brief introduction about yourself, your background, before we dive a little bit more into the topic?
Yeah, I'll try and do that shortly. I am working at University College of Northern Denmark, a UCN here in Aalborg, Denmark.
Right.
I'm a co-founder of the sport management program at UCN,
Yeah.
and then I teach around the world. I'm a visiting professor at University of San Francisco at their master's program in sport management, and I've given talks across different countries within the past couple of years. Johan Cruyff Institute, the football business master's program in Spain, Flerik Business School in Belgium. I've been up in Norway to talk to them as well. And then I do consulting in sports as well, and research. I did my PhD basically focused on the commercialization of sports and sports branding and how you can capitalize on that. And on top of that, I'm also an elite football coach. I have a UEFA A license, and for the past 6.5 years, I've worked with Aalborg BK, a professional club in Denmark. First 4 years as head coach for the men's reserves, and since January 2018, I've been the head coach for the elite women's team in Aalborg. And then I also sit on committees on the Danish FA and work closely with the Danish league system and other sports governing bodies in Denmark and abroad.
So you're involved in a lot of different things, for sure. And you've seen a lot of what is happening in the sport industry, and particularly from the business side, right?
Yeah, I mean, I try to keep myself busy, but it's a good time for a podcast right now because I'm not as busy as usual. Football is on hold currently. We have sent our players home, and they have individual training schedules to adhere to. And other than that, I've been working from home basically since the middle of March. So all teaching activities have been converted into online editions, and I've been in a lot of Skype, Zoom, or Microsoft Teams calls, so it's a different world right now.
No, for sure, but we're happy to have you here, and excited to talk about this very interesting topic. And we always enjoy, like, the whole point with this podcast, as like most of our viewers and listeners that have heard about this already, is that we want to shed light on some of the things that are happening in the industry right now, because there's so many people sitting at home, whether that's a student or like, someone working in the industry, and they're like, what is happening, and where are we going, in the next couple months, and how am I going to be prepared for the day that, this situation is over? How can we capitalize on it? And, how bad is it, essentially? And I think I'm just going to dive like right into the first question. And that is like, how is the coronavirus impacting the Nordic sports economy? And that's a pretty big one.
Yeah, I will try to answer it shortly, or we can have a dialogue about it, Ole. The way I see it, the coronavirus is definitely taking its toll on the Nordic sports economy, that's for sure. Think about the analogy of a closed production plant or assembly line. I wrote about that on my own blog. I think that the current scenario where sports have been put on hold for a while, or where competitions, tournaments, and events have been canceled, that paints a very dark picture of the Nordic
Right.
sports industry, which currently fights with the tip of its fingernails to realize a feasible going concern, to apply an accounting
Right.
term. So it's a very serious situation where sports organizations are fighting to find the resources required to keep their operations going
Right.
in a reasonable way, or where some sports organizations are simply fighting to avoid a worst case scenario of bankruptcy or liquidation of its assets. And I think that this crisis influences the lifeblood of sports, that meaning the live events, games or competitions.
Yeah.
And whether we're talking about professional sports or amateur or recreational sports, the constraints to participate in sports passively in front of the TV screen, or live in the stadium, or actively in the sports club, present. I mean, there is a situation where our participation is hindered or constrained, and that is a barrier to ongoing operations of sports organizations, and present a serious economic implications, as there may be running costs but suddenly no or limited revenues. And this puts a strain on the liquidity or cash flows of sport organizations, while also emphasizing the meaning of strong capital resources to rely on. That could be equity or access to external capital. So with this in mind, in a crisis situation with low market activity across various industries and markets, it's a very tough or almost impossible. It's very tough or almost impossible to generate a positive cash flow. And similarly, it is much harder to gain access to external capital, which manifests the urgency of the situation. And I think you have to look at things from a new from various perspectives. If you move down the economic hierarchy or ladder in professional sports, for instance, from professional football towards other team sports such as handball, ice hockey, it may be different in Sweden if we talk about the Nordic countries, or basketball, the more leagues and clubs rely on sponsorships, the harder it is. I mean, football has pretty good media deals, and the problem here is how you rely on sponsorships. If you take the case of,
like the sponsors are even in a difficult position because they're also being impacted by the coronavirus. It's not just, you know, the sport industry itself, and the sport team, but actually, you know, the sponsors, the media departments, like all essentially every entity that has been involved in feeding the teams in the industry are being impacted by that. And as you know, as a fellow Nordic, you know, the Nordic sport industry is so dependent on the sponsors and the gate revenue, I would say, you know, in order to be feasible financially. And like, we're not in a favorable position. And how bad do you think it's gonna, like, how long can essentially this coronavirus last before, you know, you will have those teams and even like the pro teams, right, that are being in a position where I can't do this anymore. Like we're just about to run out of money. Do you think where is that gap going to be?
Yeah, it's definitely a situation of urgency. If I take my own club, Aalborg BK, if you look at their last two annual financial statements, you would see that 70% of the revenues come from a combination of television money and sponsorship money. And like I said, the further down you go in terms of the economic hierarchy of sports, the more reliant clubs are on sponsorships. You see a scenario in Denmark where amateur and recreational sports definitely are also facing a challenge in terms of sponsorships, because the sponsorship market is under massive pressure as well. I mean, what does a corporation do if it experiences economic difficulties or have to lay off employees? It goes through a strategic prioritization process,
sure.
and sponsorship is not the first priority. So this may be an area that is removed. I mean, sponsorship is passion money. So often if you are facing economic difficulties in your own business, you are cutting off sponsorship. So you see that the entire sports industry is hit really hard right now. Look at the airline industry buying its way to the sports industry. Your own airline in Norway, Norwegian, is definitely facing tough times, and many airlines are engaged in sports sponsorship. So what about this? And other industries are also being really influenced by the Corona crisis. And in terms of recreational sports, I think there's an important thing to emphasize here as well, because many recreational and amateur sports are reliant not only on sponsorships, but also on professional sports being active. If we take my own club again, our recreational or amateur department is earning money for their activities based on helping with concession stands when the professional team is playing. You also
same in Norway, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And you have the same in terms of recreational and amateur sports being reliant on side events. That could be festivals, concerts, markets, fairs, etc. And where you see athletes and parents from the recreational department earning money from those activities to boost their own activities. And now all of these events have been canceled or postponed. And this is not good for amateur or recreational sports.
For sure.
While they also may experience small decreases in revenue because some people resign or save subscription fees. At least for now, that is not a big proportion of members that tend to resign. But my own kids play sports in a recreational club nearby, and my oldest son, his team has seen 10% of members resigning, and that also means something.
That's pretty huge. You know?
Yeah, but luckily in Denmark and Norway, Sweden, the Scandics or Scandinavian countries, we can rely on subsidies from the local municipalities or from the government. And that's a good thing in this situation, at least.
So let's talk a little bit about like what kind of initiatives though are being taken and being done in Denmark right now. And I will talk a little bit about what's happening in Norway too, but like what kind of initiatives are being done to ease the economic pain? You talk a little bit about like the governmental subsidies, but like can you dive a little bit more like what exactly are they contributing with, and like how far do you think that will stretch? Like, is it enough? Like, do you need more, or like how will the small team cope with it, and how will the big teams cope with it?
I mean, various packages have been issued by the government to support professional as well as amateur and recreational sports. For instance, professional sport clubs can be compensated in relation to salaries to employees who have been sent home from work. Sports Confederation of Denmark and the National Olympic Committee received money from the government to compensate amateur and recreational sport organizations. And recently, the Danish government extended the economic compensation package to event hosts until the end of August, and reduced the limit from 1,000 to 350 participants, which means that smaller events may be compensated, and that definitely helps. And it's also very important because the Scandinavian sports model is reliant on amateur sports organization being somewhat funded from the many side events that I talked about before, that are existing in the sports landscape. And now there is compensation if a sports organization is facing a deficit from a canceled event. And this comes at a time after the Danish Ministry of Culture in the beginning of April came up with an economic package of 50 million Danish kroners to help local amateur sports organizations, and as a supplement to how sports organizations could benefit from the salary compensation package, which I also mentioned here.
Right.
And in Norway, you have seen that the Norwegian Sports Confederation have asked sports organizations and clubs to elaborate on how the corona crisis affects activities and thus the economic operations of the organizations.
Yeah.
And additionally, the Norwegian government provided, I think, 600 million Norwegian kroner to the sports and voluntary sector in March. But professional clubs in Denmark, I used to play in Viborg. I know that they have established support activities through social media platforms to collect money to help the club. And I've also seen that amateur clubs have launched extraordinary subscription activities. I used to be a coach in a recreational club, and I have subscribed to help that club as a passive member, which is also a way for clubs to earn money, because this is a time where clubs need to be creative in relation to the revenue side. And then if you look at professional football, for instance, professional football in Europe, because it's a religion, seems to have its own life. And there has been a situation where you have seen that leagues have not canceled because it will be too expensive. If you look at leagues not getting the enormous revenues from media deals, but as we have seen with football globally, this proves a point regarding the economic and political power of football and football's instrumental ability to influence society. Because why can footballers in a game with a lot of personal contact be allowed to train when schools and cultural institutions and corporations are shut down? I mean, that's an interesting question in itself and speaks to some of the elements.
I mean, like it's a massive industry, but going back a little bit to Norway, is that, as you mentioned, like the government provided like an original package, right, to help make the industry a little bit easier in terms of the sports teams. However, there's a lot of minor organizations and those tiny teams that are struggling hard now, right? Because, you know, as we mentioned, like they're so dependent on their sponsors, and maybe that's even like, you know, very tiny sponsorships that, you know, now are maybe representing small businesses that had that money on the side to just, okay, we can do that for you now. But at this point, their business is also being impacted. Hence, as you mentioned, they started doing research in order to categorize and understand, okay, what are the challenges here and how much money do we actually need? And we saw right now actually happen a couple of days ago where you could apply for some additional funding essentially for your teams. And it was like it was close to like 500 teams and organizations that have applied for that extra funding. So that talks a little bit about actually how bad the situation is. And even though like this would trickle down, you know, from the 600 millions, there's clearly a need for more. But I do think, however, and which is happening now too, is that they will dive a little bit further into really sorry about the background, really dive deeper into the governmental side of understanding, okay, by doing this research and understanding from the top and going down, like how many teams needs the extra funding and how much is actually, you know, needed. While I also see, you know, professional teams like Molde Football Club, like others that are been taking this seriously from day one. And of course, like there's also a range of like, what is your economic impact? But what we saw as well is that the players, the staff, they all understand the situation and they're okay with being permitted or what it might be, because this is just a state of the fact right now. You know, what is the most important thing? The most important thing is minimize the length of the virus, right? And the sooner they are back to playing, even that, if that is for like no people in the stadium, it's still better than, you know, not having the competition at all. Like talking about the Norwegian Football League, which we're supposed to start essentially in the beginning of April. You know, now it's delayed essentially till the end of June, if I'm not mistaken. And that's kind of like the timeline everyone is working on now, and everyone is working in like those training in like 5-5 groups. And I think we will see. And I think in Norway, at least, I think it's realistic that you might be able to start games after June, but with no spectators. So this will impact how will I like. It's a huge revenue, of course, like to lose all your fans attending the games, because it's a huge part. But at the same time, this is where your creativity in terms of like engagement for the media and how you can bring in, you know, more revenue, more value from the extra additional assets that you have. And you talked a little bit about extra initiatives that are happening. I saw like some of the clubs here in Norway, they're essentially creating like a new wall in the stadium where you can buy a brick essentially. And you know, it's a cool initiative. And I think like now is the time to be creative. And what I do enjoy, and what has been probably my highlight of like all this podcast too, is that we're all in the same situation. Like we're all facing this coronavirus. Of course, there's always differential of like how bad and how the economic and all this situation is, but everyone understands, and everyone like wants to try to solve it and help each other. And that something that I think we need to like have in the back of our mind is that we're all fighting against the same thing. Now is the time to really work together, and every little thing that you contribute with will help that part. So I know that was a long like direction of like what's happening in Norway, but like what are your thoughts on and they're just going into a little bit between the gap, right, between like the rich and what I call like the poor teams, or like the amateur sports. Do you think, and maybe even like in a, like if you just think about like the Danish top league, you know, the Superliga, and just talking about like Copenhagen, right, and then like one of the lower end teams, like will the gap be larger now after this crisis?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ole. There's already a large gap between the biggest sports league and less commercially privileged sports leagues, which adds a spillover effect on the gap between the richest sports teams. For instance, the Real Madrids, the FC Barcelonas, or the Manchester Uniteds, to mention football or soccer, or the Dallas Cowboys, the New England Patriots, the Golden State Warriors, the Lakers, the Knicks, or the New York Yankees, and the small market of financially poor teams. And that also goes for the Nordic countries. There's definitely a difference between Molde and smaller teams in Norway, or FC Copenhagen and smaller teams in the Danish Super League in football or soccer. But to answer your question, I would say that this depends on time and context. FC Copenhagen is also hit really hard because there's depth in the organization. They have business units such as a big vacation center that is also shut down in terms of revenue generation at the moment. So I would say that this depends on time and context. And as of right now, it is important to have a solid cash situation and strong capital resources. I mean, the problem short term is that stock prices and valuations of top clubs go down, and even big clubs such as Manchester United may have financial obligations in terms of unpaid transfer money, which is a challenge in a situation where there's limited revenue generation. However, some top clubs, such as Bayern Munich, for instance, have better capital resources to rely on and will also find its way back in business after this crisis, whereas clubs at lower levels may be at higher risk in terms of bankruptcy. You've seen that in German football, for instance. Some of the clubs in the second Bundesliga have been hit harder than the top clubs in the Bundesliga, like Bayern Munich, because also the ownership structures is different. Bayern Munich is also owned by partly Allianz, Adidas, and Audi. But the problem here is that there is a trickle down effect
Yeah.
in the sports economy, such as a money flow from buying clubs to selling clubs, if we take professional sports and
Right.
football as an example here, which with the current situation is somewhat jeopardized. There is a growing insecurity on the transfer market, and this plays a role in football because the Nordic leagues are selling leagues
Right. Right.
compared to the Premier League, which is a buying league.
Yeah.
So if there is low activity on the transfer market, it's going to hit hard on some of the Danish or Scandinavian clubs, which
For sure.
strategically prioritizes to sell players to go from a negative financial result to a positive financial
Right.
result in terms of the annual financial statement. Eventually, we'll get back to normal conditions, but it will take some time. And then to go on in terms of my argument that time and context plays a role. In the United States, for instance, there is a
Yeah.
more centrally governed and thus collectivistic approach to professional sports.
Right.
So the situation is different over there in terms of professional sports, because there is this single entity structure where clubs benefit from revenue sharing. But
Right.
in this situation, it comes down to solid ownership,
Yeah.
also from capital perspective, because what we have seen in Scandinavian countries in terms of professional sports is that this crisis is a big and serious problem for clubs that have experienced negative financial results in recent years, and
Yeah.
clubs that at the same time don't have a solid situation in terms of capital resources, because the sponsorship market has been hit hard,
Right.
and we have a production line that is currently on hold. And also it's tough to secure external capital from banks or from
For sure.
potential external investors in this current market or climate.
Right. So this is something that they did in Norway, though, which I was something that were particularly aimed towards businesses, right? And of course, like essentially after the dual model coming into the sport industry, like a decade ago, you will have like all these business entities, right, representing the Nordic teams, and you saw, like, especially in Norway, they opened up essentially like a deal with the banks in order to provide them with more money so they could provide that good loan benefits for whatever kind of organization you are. And I think, like, of course it stretched a certain point in order to help trickle that effect, but you might end up in kind of like a new red like situation for a lot of the teams here, where as you also touch clearly upon, especially in terms of the Nordic sport industry, right, where you're depending on selling your players, in terms of like, and even like developing, right, and developing players. And now, like, no one is training together, more or less. You can't bring in the new talents because, I mean, like, everything is literally on stop, and then no one is buying, right, because everyone is trying to save money. And I think, like you said, that will hit pretty hard. But I mean, like, you call this sort of like a wake-up call for the sport business industry. And the interesting part is, like, where do we go from here? And, like, we're going to touch a little bit, like, briefly, like, before we wrap up, about the sponsorship market too. But one of the things that I'm curious about, and what I'm afraid we might see, is that maybe not the sponsors are, they already contributed in a sense to the teams, right? And like what their commitment is for 2020, and maybe even longer. But I'm afraid for those teams or sports organization where the sponsorship ends by the end of the year, and you suddenly have a lot of businesses that can't renew,
Yeah.
what then? What are how are the teams going to cope with that? And that's probably what I'm most afraid of, is like you will end up in a position in a year from now where there's so few sponsors that are willing or can contribute, because they've been hitting so hard themselves that they need to, like, as you said, it's like a privilege, right? An extra additional benefit that they want to do because they can. but now maybe they can't. And what do you like? Where do we go from here? And what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, you have seen major events not being canceled, but also
Right.
being postponed.
Right.
And
Right. The Olympics, for instance.
yeah, exactly. So that speaks to what you're talking about here. I was on a podcast with TV2 Denmark last week or the week before, where we also had um, a professional athlete taking part in the podcast, an
Right.
Olympic athlete that won medals in the London Olympics and that was looking forward to participating in the Tokyo
Right.
Olympics. And one of the concerns was um, she participates in rowing, and rowing is a niche sport
Yeah.
compared to football in the Nordic countries, or
Right.
handball or
Right.
ice hockey.
Yeah.
So her concern was that sponsors would withdraw because now they had to pay for another year. But luckily, as we have seen in Denmark, the big corporations supported the Olympic movement. And
Nice.
I think in terms of major events, luckily or fortunately enough, you have a situation where sponsors have already invested in a 4-year cycle.
Right.
So the culmination in terms of return on investment, return on engagement, and return on objectives in
Yeah.
terms of the money that they pay for in terms of their sponsorship is culminating now next year in
Right.
Japan.
Right.
So a lot of them want to secure their investment. And I think the good part here is that a lot of the sponsors that are associated with the Olympics or with UEFA Champions League or the European Championship
Right.
are sponsors or corporations with deep pockets. So luckily
Right.
here you saw that the sponsors were still backing. In terms of the European Championship,
Yeah.
it has been a discussion also in the media if Copenhagen will still host the event next year, because it may
Right. Right.
collide with Copenhagen also hosting part of the Tour de France. So how does that link
Interesting.
up with hotel capacity
Right.
in the city? What about the urban space and commercial rights in
Yeah.
terms of that? So in terms of these major events, also the European Championship, which is spread across
Yeah.
European cities, this may add some complexity, but I
Right.
think it's important also to underscore here the fact that these major events have not been canceled. So we will
Right.
see an economic periodization. So
Right.
it would have been an economic catastrophe if these major events had been canceled
Right.
instead of being postponed.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
makes a difference in terms of time and context.
For sure.
Now there will be a situation where UEFA, in terms of the European Championship, the main rights holder, has secured that the events takes place. That's important. Same
Right.
thing with the Olympics
Yeah.
and the IOC. And this means that what sponsors have paid for instance, the main event, the Olympics or the European
Right.
Championship, will still go on, though in 2021 instead of 2020.
Yeah.
Yet there may be some rights questions or situation where sponsors could be affected by the corona crisis,
Yeah.
but most likely in terms of major events such as
Right.
the Olympics or the European Championship, we will see a situation where these major corporate sponsors or brands such as Heineken or Coca-Cola, fast-moving consumer goods, probably still have the financial sustaining power
For sure.
to back the European Championship or the Olympics despite corona. If you take the UEFA Champions League, I believe that we will see some kind of completion. I don't know about the tournament structure for this, but we
Right.
will see some kind of completion of this year's edition. That's why UEFA is working really hard right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of course, it would be a major blow for UEFA as a rights holder if this season ends up being cancelled,
Right.
and if this in that case results in rights questions
Yeah.
from broadcasting partners and sponsors
Very
due
good
to the
point.
fact that they then don't feel that they get the expected value according to the ongoing deal or contract. Still, I think that we'll see the tournament play out, and this is the dialogue, as I said, of UEFA these days,
Right.
also relating to national FAs and leagues. And as in the case of the European Championship, UEFA's Champions League partners are also major corporations or brands, such as, for instance, Heineken, MasterCard, Nissan,
Right.
PepsiCo, etc. But there will be a dip in revenues for the clubs, of course, if the completion of the tournament is played without fans. And
Right.
this is the main issue for UEFA, because the economic operations of governing bodies are dependent on what goes on beneath this overlying umbrella level.
Right.
That means at the national FA, league, and club level, and how these levels are intertwined with UEFA's cross-border competitions. And
For sure.
I think this explains why UEFA is so focused on national federations or leagues not canceling
Yeah.
tournaments, as we've seen in the case of
Yeah.
the Jupiler League in Belgium. Basically, the decision that the Belgium League first canceled was
Mm.
overruled by UEFA, that came
Right.
and said, if that's happening, we may exclude you from UEFA competitions.
Right.
And I think
That's
you're,
rough.
in addition, Ole, what people have to understand is the mutually beneficial interdependence between rights holders such as UEFA,
Yeah.
the television partners, and the sponsors. So there's a lot on stake for all these partners in the ecosystem of top sports and top football. I mean,
Right.
television broadcasting pays big bucks for the highly, in the eyes of
Yeah.
fans,
Yeah.
of the most popular sport, if we take football,
Yeah.
of the highly relevant sports product of football to football's rights holders, such as UEFA. The media know that this high demand content will move, or have the ability to move, customers and market shares, while being capable of attracting paying eyeballs who are willing to subscribe to or engage with football on television, associated with the convenience of sitting basically at home with the remote control in your hands, and being able to shelter in the living room while enjoying a beer from some of the paying advertisers such as
Right.
Heineken. So
Right.
at the same time, I mean, football, UEFA, national FAs, leagues, and clubs capitalize on the sponsor interest associated with the game taking place live in the stadium. And this coronavirus is a threat to the live stadium experience.
Yeah.
For what reason all players in this ecosystem, the way I see it, cling to the hope of the competitions not being totally banned, but rather taking place in an alternative format via the
For sure.
so-called ghost games without fans in the stadium. And this alternative gives broadcasting partners the ability to show the games, and thus for all commercial partners to let the product keep breathing and staying relevant in the minds of fans worldwide. And the same goes on in Scandinavia, where the football leagues and clubs rely on its passionate appeal to business to consumers and
100%.
business to business stakeholders, primarily at the local and regional level here in Scandinavia, but also maintaining the overall obligation to entertain people and meet the huge national interest for the game of football and other sports.
Right. Well,
it was a long answer.
I think to start wrapping up though, I think it's what I think we're gonna see is, I think we will see a boost of innovation when it comes to how people are showcasing the sports, like at home, like on TV. The media side, I think will receive a creative innovation happening in the next few months because of this, because they have to think outside the box, right? Like, how are we engaging? Because when the sports starts, everything comes, right? Essentially at once again. Of course, like maybe not being physical at the stadium. Hence, how are you keeping that, how can I say, like being at the stadium experience, right? But being from home and utilizing that as a tool of getting new users, getting new people to sign up and view that. And what I do like though for like next year, just a little bit kind of like looking on the bright side here with the European Championship, is that I think it's the best thing that could happen is that next European Championship is in all the different host cities, because it means that they will have the opportunity to receive a lot of revenue from visitors. While in fact, in general, it was just in one country, right? So now it's spread out, and you will see a huge revenue boost that I think the European countries will benefit from, and what they will need in the situation that is happening right now. So I think we're kind of lucky in a sense that that was the case for next year European Championship. And then I think we will see a lot of innovation on the media side, and how you are going to, in the best possible way, engage your audience that are sitting home. And you will see that maybe some new startups, maybe some new technology that are going to be based into like keeping your audience engaged, because now it's going to be this probably out, I would guess out 2020, there will be no people on the stadiums. It's my guess, but let's see. Hopefully before, but that's what I think.
Yeah, and you're right in terms of that. I mean, I heard a Japanese doctor, a medical professor, talking about the fact whether or not the Olympics in Tokyo could take place also next year, or
Right.
if it would still be threatened. And it also comes down to participants from all over the world and from less privileged countries than Norway, Sweden,
Right.
or Denmark, or Finland here in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
I mean, they have the test equipment to make sure that the Olympics could take place in a way that is responsible from a health angle. And
Right.
I mean, in terms of this, the time factor is critical. The
Right.
time factor is critical for
Yeah.
sports governing bodies, for leagues, for clubs, and
everyone.
for everyone investing in professional sports. But I totally agree. We also have to look at the bright side of life,
Right.
to quote a famous song. And we need to see some positive disruption here,
Right.
such as, for instance, new questions regarding financial management in professional sports, because professional sports is standing on a burning platform right now, because there are ongoing costs in terms of professional athletes being on contracts, and if the contract value takes up a big chunk of the turnover, it's already a cash flow balance that is under pressure. And we also need to see some positive disruption in terms of creative means to revenue generation or content production that you were talking about. There was a recent Michael Jordan example in terms of some content that Jordan kept hidden for many years that came out recently.
Oh, yeah. On Netflix,
and I mean,
right?
yeah, exactly. It's just a perfect example, because Netflix is an organization that is thriving these days.
Right. They have an enormous boost.
Yeah, another example could be esports. Esports platforms such as what is the platform called that is Twitch, owned by Amazon. And esport is a sport that is benefiting from its digital understanding in these times, and we may also see new investors with deep capital pockets going into sports to benefit from the current market situation where cash is king.
I think we need to have another topic, though, just discussing who will be the new sponsors in the sport industry. Because I mean, like, just like we just roughly started like Facebook, Tinder, like all these coming in, into the sport industry, and now probably Netflix and other entities that are having this boost effect, right, of the situation. And there's a lot of platforms and social solutions that are boosting from this current situation that will sit on a top heavy revenue. Maybe we'll see a change in the landscape of sponsorship, especially in terms of the global ones. But we'll take that at another time. I think it's been a long conversation. We could probably keep going for like hours and hours. It's a lot of interesting stuff happening, and I'm super glad to have you be part of it. So Kenneth, I would like to thank you for the time. I truly appreciate it, and we're looking forward to see what our next episodes will bring, and we'll certainly probably have a new discussion in a future day about what is happening, maybe when things are stabilizing a little bit more, and what actions are going to be taken, because there's a lot to discuss here.
Yeah, and this will definitely change the competitive landscape in the sports industry, because there is room for lucrative deals also to be made, but
For sure.
it requires people with deep pockets, or you may also see some goodwill to be earned from corporations with the economic resources to save or to back or support sports. But this has been a pleasure, Ole. I appreciate the chance to participate in your podcast, and I hope that your audience can benefit from our discussion.
100%. So, Kenneth, thank you once again for the time. And we always finish with "Vi snackes," which means, I mean, like you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Bye bye.